Hey guys, how are you all doing today? Thanks for being here. Of all places that you could be, I'm so glad that you're here with me today. My name's Barb. Welcome to Halfway to Sane, where together we explore real cases with respect and clarity and curiosity. In a world where truth hides in the shadows, we uncover the stories that refuse to stay buried, and every case deserves to be told. Now, today we are going to be discussing the execution of Ronald Palmer Heath. I don't have a whole lot of information on him, so it's going to be short, but well, let's get into it. So anyway, Michael Sheridan, a traveling salesman, struck up a conversation with brothers Ronald and Kenneth Heath at the Porpoise, which was a dive bar, while on a business trip to Gainesville. He bought them drinks, he introduced himself as from being out of town, and he asked them if they knew how to get the Gainesville Green. The Mary J, if you know what I mean. So, these two brothers had a history of legal trouble. And Ronald, he had previously been sentenced to 30 years in prison when he was 16 years old for second-degree murder. And when he was convicted of repeatedly stabbing a man that he said made unwanted sexual advances on him. He ultimately beat the teenager Michael Green to death with a log. And Kenneth, he had several burglary convictions and was released from jail 3 months earlier. But after hanging out at the bar for some time, the three men did decide to go somewhere else to smoke some. And Michael did hesitate on going with them at first because he had an early meeting that he needed to attend to and he didn't want to be tired. But he went, and at some point, Ronald and Kenneth plotted to rob Michael. Now, Ronald drove them all to a remote area where Kenneth ended up pulling a gun on Michael, who initially did refuse to give the men anything, which peed off Kenneth. So Kenneth shot Michael in the chest. And this apparently didn't kill him because Michael started to empty his pockets, but Ronald began kicking him and then started stabbing him with a hunting knife, and he tried to slit his throat, but the knife was too dull, and Kenneth ultimately ended up shooting him twice in the head. Now, the brothers dumped Michael's body in a wooded area, and they returned to the bar to take items from Michael's rental car, and then they burned the car. And the men took Michael's credit cards, and they happened to make multiple purchases with the credit cards. Now, Ronald was arrested several weeks later at his home in Douglas, Georgia, after investigators had connected him to the stolen credit cards. And the officers recovered clothing that was purchased with the credit cards, as well as Michael's watch. Now, Kenneth was also charged with murder, but was sentenced to life in prison as part of a plea agreement. And days after Michael's death, there happened to have been a body of a man named Tony Hammett that was also found, that according to the Duval County court records, they say Ronald Heath also shot and killed this man. But he was charged with his murder, but however, the case never went to trial. So that is literally all the information that I could find. So I'm going to jump to Ronald's execution. And Michael, the man who was killed, 5 of his brothers and one of his sisters, who I guess were all from upstate New York, as well as 5 of his nephews, attended the execution. Now, they had fought for this execution to be carried out for decades, and they flooded the Florida governor's office with calls and letters throughout the years. And Thomas, which was one of the brothers, he thanked the governor, Ron DeSantis, for signing the death warrant. And one thing that Thomas always emphasized in his communications was the number of Ronald's victims. And Ronald was a serial killer. And, he felt that this man should be brought to death. He said his brother Michael was a very liked and trusting person. People gravitated to him, and he took people at their word and at their face value, and he thinks that that was leveraged against him the night that he was killed. And he said that today's outcome, the execution date, is the culmination of polite patience, dogged determination, and keeping hope alive for justice to be served. He said, tonight, Ronald Palmer Heath was released to the custody of his new parole officer, and any forgiveness is between him and God. He said, a final thank you for ordering the Ronald Palmer cocktail on January 9th for tonight's service. And Governor, as we agreed, that goes on my bar tab. I like that. Now, Ronald was the first man from Florida that was executed for the year of 2026. He was 64 years old when he was executed on February 10th by lethal injection. He was on death row for 35 years, and the lethal injection went as planned, and he was declared deceased at 6:12 p.m. He did refuse a last meal or any counseling. And when the curtain to the execution chamber went up at the scheduled 6 p.m. start time, Ronald was already strapped down with an IV inserted in his arm. Asked by the warden if he had any final statement, he did say, "I'm sorry. That's all I can say. Thank you." As the drugs were being administered, Ronald showed little outward reaction, closing his eyes and then appearing to have fallen asleep, becoming motionless. A medic was called in about 8 minutes after the drug began, and he was declared deceased 2 minutes later. Now, Kimberly Reeves, Anthony's sister, said that Ronald being executed doesn't change the facts or bring her brother back. She said she still mourns and dreams of her brother, but she doesn't delight in the death penalty. And she said she hopes Ronald Heath is at peace. She said Ronald had an appeal after appeal after appeal, and none of our brothers were ever able to appeal for their lives, not once. Now, Rhonda Green, who was the sister of Michael Green, said that though Ronald Heath's execution did not bring her happiness, it was a necessary form of justice. Michael was a funny, outgoing, and loved to fish. It's horrendous that it took so long for justice. Now, there were more than 50 people that came to protest Ronald Heath's execution. They said Ronnie was put to death for a murder he did not commit. The undisputed trigger man in that crime was Ronnie's brother Kenneth, who received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Now, Ronald Heath's death followed the executions of 19 prisoners in Florida last year in 2025, which was by far the most in the United States. So, yeah, that's a lot. So, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that. I know there wasn't a whole lot of information, but what are your thoughts on the death penalty? Do you feel an eye for an eye? But I would like to thank you for spending time learning about the case, as little as there was. But with that being said, remember, behind every headline is a real person or people whose stories deserve to be told. Now, if you did enjoy hearing this, do me a favor. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, and share. I would greatly appreciate it. It does help me out a lot. And turn your notifications on so that you always get your updates. But do me a favor, leave your thoughts down below. I would like to hear from them. And as always, if you have any suggestions on any other stories that you would like to hear, I would love to hear about them. Until next time.